Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, episode 386. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by the generous patronage of Nobilis Erotica listeners. To help out paying the authors and voices that create these stories, visit patreon.com/Nobilis. Patrons get access to 2 exclusive episodes every month. We're currently running Everfull Cup, a really big fantasy erotic romance. Our Patreon-supported story for November is Thumbling by Elizabeth Black. Elizabeth's articles and stories have been published by Circlet Press, Playas Press, Excite Books, House of Erotica, Ravenous Romance, Scarlet Magazine, Sexist Magazine, Alternate, Ms. Magazine blog, and Good Vibrations Magazine, among many others. She lives in Massachusetts with her family of humans and cats. I usually don't put warnings in front of stories. I mean, most of the time, you folks know what you're in for. But this one deserves a special mention. Thumbling contains a description of sexual assault that some listeners might find disturbing. If this describes you, feel free to skip listening this time. I guarantee we'll have more fiction coming up very soon. Still with me? All right, here we go. Thumbling by Elizabeth Black. Thumbling watched the servant girl from his hidden spot on the wooden table, behind a bag of apples. The barn was airy, and he pulled his coat around him tighter to fend off the cold. Standing only as tall as a lover's hand, the little man's talent for getting into tight spaces endangered him, but he was such a thrill-seeker he craved the risks. The high risk of being seen from his vantage point behind the 5-pound sack only excited him more, for the servant girl's curves made him twitch and grow in his most private of places. She bent before him, shoveling hay into a corner, her ripe bottom barely hidden beneath her thin, tattered skirt. Her ass as round and as supple as a peach. He stepped out from behind a sack to reach out and grab a plump cheek as she backed closer to the table. Then, without warning, she tossed the rake aside and turned around. "Eek! A mouse!" she shrieked when she saw him. "Not a mouse," he said. "Eek! A mouse that speaks!" she shrieked again. "There's no need to be afraid," he said. "I won't hurt you. I'm not a mouse, but a man, small though I may be." She leaned in closer to get a better look at him, and as she did so her blouse fell forward, revealing twin tits as round and succulent as her scrumptious bottom. Thumbling shifted back and forth from one foot to the other to make room for his growing cock in his trousers. She squinted at him. "So what's your name?" "Thumbling, for I am as small as your thumb." "You look taller to me." "That's true, I'm actually 6 inches." He gave her a big, amused grin. "As large as necessary to please you." "How coy of you! Naughty little man. You think you can please me?" "I know I can." He eyed up her ratty skirt, blouse, and corset and shivered. "Aren't you cold, dressed in such thin clothing? I'm so cold I can see my breath." He watched as her nipples hardened in the cool air. The sight made him shift his hips to alleviate the agony between his legs. "What's it to you?" she asked as she straightened up. "How did you get in here? Are you spying on me?" He stood before her, defiant, arms akimbo, cock thrusting forward as if to say, "Hi there." "I snuck in on your horse's mane, and she was kind enough to drop me on this table. But I'm sad to see there's nothing to eat other than apples. Have you some warm bread and hot soup you may share with a visitor?" It was her turn to stand with arms akimbo. "Why should I share with you? What do I get in return?" Before he could answer, the lock to the door rattled. "Oh, no!" the servant girl whispered. "My master is coming in. Hide!" She grabbed him by the back of his coat, opened the bag of apples, and dropped him in. He pulled the burlap down so he could see out of the sack without being spotted. The door opened, and a fat, flushed, old, balding man stepped into the barn. "Girl, who were you talking to?" the man bellowed. "No one. I was praying," she said, without missing a beat. Thumbling nearly laughed out loud, for the girl was a good liar. "My wife is asleep. I'm in need of you." He approached her as he unbuckled his belt. Thumbling looked at the girl as a frown spread across her face, to be replaced by a plastic smile. The man pulled his shirt from his pants, revealing a grotesque belly and a hairy lower back. Thumbling wondered how often the poor girl was forced to contend with the disgusting man's urges. "I am much more attractive and pleasant than this ogre, and I can pleasure her in ways he can only dream of." Without asking permission, because of course he didn't, for that would require decorum and consideration the man did not possess, he grabbed the girl by one shoulder and spun her around to face away from him. She lost her balance and gripped the edge of the table. With a grunt, he pressed one beefy hand against the center of her back and shoved her forward. He lifted her skirt with his other hand and kicked her feet until she spread her legs apart. "This is horrible. How dare he treat her with such disdain? She's nothing more than a cum receptacle for him. How often does he accost her? I must show her the consideration and attention she deserves, if she wishes that from me." The man dropped his trousers, revealing his corpulent and pockmarked backside. The revolting sight turned Thumbling's stomach, but what the man did next enraged him, for he grasped the maid's hair in one beefy fist, and shoved his prick home with his other hand. She jerked forward with his thrusting momentum. He used so much force he lifted her from the floor, her feet dangling in the air as she balanced herself face down on the table. Her face was a mask of boredom and disgust, and resignation. Thumbling knew the man's fumblings were a constant occurrence. He felt both sorry and disgusted for her. How could he help her out of her predicament? With a grunt, the man shoved her so hard she nearly bumped into the sack of apples in which he hid. She glanced at him and pursed her lips. The frustration in her face did not escape his attention. "What can I do to aid her? I feel so helpless, so small and ineffective a rescuer. If I reveal myself and defend her, he will only squash me like a bug." The man knotted his fingers into her hair and yanked her head back as if he were riding a stallion. She cried out in pain, which only enraged Thumbling more. As the man thrust, he slapped her ass cheek until it turned pink. "You're mine, you minx. I won't let another man have you. Is this good for you?" he groaned. "Yes, master." Could he hear the lie in her voice? "Not that it matters. You're here to service me." With a final grunt, he thrust into her several more times, then pulled away. He grabbed a rag from the table, wiped himself down, and tossed the rag to the floor. Then he pulled up his pants and tucked in his shirt. Belt buckled, he left her leaning against the table. As he walked out of the barn, he spoke. "Have dinner ready at 6. Don't burn the toast this time, or I'll beat you again." When he was gone, Thumbling emerged from behind the apple and stepped out of the bag. "Are you okay?" he asked in a quiet voice. She sighed. "I'm fine. You get used to it after a while. He's not so bad. I've had worse." She grabbed a clean towel and dipped it in a basin of water. Then she reached beneath her skirts and cleaned herself. "Can you leave?" "And go where? I have no home, no relations, no husband or lover." She grasped another clean towel and dried herself. "I take it telling his wife is out of the question." "The governess who did that got tossed out, and his wife blamed her for the pig abusing her." He sat on an apple and sighed. "I wish I could help you. You deserve better than him." She smiled and touched the top of his head with one finger. "You're very kind. I haven't met a kind soul in a long time." "Did he hurt you?" "No, it's not as bad as it could be. He threatens to beat me, but he usually doesn't." "Usually?" Thumbling cocked his disbelieving head at her. "You're very observant. There's no excuse for him touching me at all. I hate it. He's selfish and he stinks of sheep poo and whiskey. I always end up frustrated." "Has he ever satisfied you?" "Are you kidding?" "Has anyone ever satisfied you?" Her eyes gazed inward. "No, not really. I wish I could meet a man who would drive me mad with desire, but there's no one that exciting around for miles." She looked at him and smiled. "You could be interesting. You're so small you can fit anywhere, inside or outside me." "Would you like to give me a try?" he asked. Say yes, please." It was her turn to cock her head to one side. "Now how could you possibly please me?" "Just drop me down your blouse and I'll show you." She let out a delightful giggle, picked him up by the back of his jacket, and dropped him into that yawning cleavage. The heat from her breasts warmed him, and he could no longer see his breath. He pressed his hands against her sternum and felt her heart fluttering beneath his fingers. "She's aroused. Now to tease her until she can't take it any more." With broad motions, he stroked those twin globes with both hands, fingers spread wide to take in as much of her ample flesh as possible. Goosebumps formed on her skin that he presumed was both from the cold and from her own excitement. He pressed his lips against the curve of her right breast and blew butterfly kisses on it. She giggled and squirmed and then shook her torso, making her breasts squeeze together to trap him in her delicious embrace. He shifted his body until his head was next to her right nipple. He took the butt in his hands and squeezed. She let out a quick breath and sighed, as her heart quickened so much he felt it beat against his legs. He squeezed again and she laughed. Smiling, he stroked that butt until it stood erect and purple. Then he pressed his lips against it. She shivered and moaned as she laid herself down in the hay and lifted her skirts. "Don't stop," she said. "You feel incredibly good. Kiss me as I stroke myself." She lay down in a pile of hay as he opened his mouth and took in her entire nipple. Sucking with the gentleness of a baby, he stroked his lips along the length of her nipple as he flicked his tongue around it. To his surprise, it grew even larger, just as he was growing so stiff the ache overpowered him, but he refused his own release. He stroked her breast with his hands as he sucked on her bud, listening to the thumping of her heart and the moans coming from deep in her throat. She pressed her hand against him, as if to make sure he was real. She lowered her blouse to her waist and gripped her free breast with one hand. As he sucked, she pulled on her other nipple until it stood even with the one he pleasured. With a shudder, she cried out in ecstasy as she writhed in the throes of her climax. Her hard nipple seemed to turn to stone as he sucked, and her heart pounded so hard he feared it would crush him. Spent, she relaxed with contented sighs. He rested against her right breast, treating it as if it were an especially large pillow. "Did that feel good?" he asked. "It was amazing. You found my weak spot. Any man who sucks on my nipples will turn me into a puddle of goo in seconds." He bent his arms at the elbow and rested his hands behind his head. "I'm glad I made you feel good. That made me very happy." "I don't feel completely satisfied, though. I want more." "Ah, an insatiable slut you are," he said as he stood and gazed into her eyes from the vantage point of her breast. "If you thought my attention to your tits was amazing, you should see what I can do between your legs." "Is that a dare?" she said. "It's a dare I'd happily take on." "Even though that beast just had his way with me?" "I'll replace him for you body and soul, so you'll never have to suffer his assaults ever again." "Then have at it." She once again picked him up by the back of his jacket and dropped him in the hay between her thighs. Her skirts were already bunched up around her waist from the moments earlier when she had pleasured herself. Her musky smell assailed him, and he swooned from the pleasant aroma. Oh, he was going to make her so weak in the knees she wouldn't be able to walk for a week. Her supple flesh glistened beneath her skirts. He touched one hand to her labia and basked in the warmth. Then he stroked downwards, slowly and gently. "Oh, don't stop," she said. "I like that." Taking her at her word, he brushed his hands back and forth against her folds until they glowed pink. She moaned and giggled, but he wanted a more intense reaction from her. He leaned his body against her slit and stroked her with his arms while brushing wet kisses along the soft skin. She arched her back. "Ah, that's more like it." She grew moist and even warmer as he stroked. He buried his face in her flesh, feeling her arousal on his cheeks as he inhaled her strong aroma. God, what bliss! He stroked her in this delicious fashion for several minutes until he felt she was warmed up enough, and then he slid one arm deep inside her slit. She groaned in ecstasy. Good, her arousal was exactly what he wanted. Her clit had peeked out from beneath her folds. The sight of it made him giddy with pleasure. He grasped it in both hands and gently pulled back the hood. She cried out. Then he lowered his mouth to her clit and stroked it with his lips and tongue. He wanted this as much as she did. She rocked from side to side with such momentum that he nearly lost his balance. It would not do to lose his grip, not as she neared her most ecstatic moment. He massaged her clit for several minutes while she grew wetter, bathing him in her fluids. Her sweet scent covered him, and he inhaled deeply to take it all in. When he felt she was beside herself with arousal, he slipped his body between her lips and entered her feet first, as if crossing a threshold. She cried out. He rolled his body from side to side, with his head sticking out of her so he could breathe. She was so tight she could smother him if he entered her head first. He stroked her walls with his arms and legs as she writhed with pleasure. Then she reached out and stroked her clit with both hands, fingers spread wide. With a cry, she came around him like an earthquake. She tightened and loosened around him, then tightened again. Her pulsations aroused him and brought him to full erection. As she came, he stroked himself until he could bear the pressure no longer, and he came good and hard inside her. Spent, he slipped out of her and curled up in the hay. She lay spread-eagled on her back, panting from her own exertions. As they rested, she giggled. "What's so funny?" he asked. "Nothing. I just feel incredibly good. You have replaced that old goat. You're amazing." He smiled. "I know." They both laughed. He brushed himself off and then stood. "Have you a pan of water I may bathe in? My clothing is also in need of a clean." "Why, certainly," she said. She held out her hand, and he walked onto her palm. "Here is clean water and a clean towel. There is soap, too. Use as much as you like." "Thank you. You are too kind." He stripped himself naked and bathed. "Can you stay?" she asked. "I'm afraid I can't. I'm seeking my fortune, and I must find the riches that await me. I wish I could be with you longer." Once he finished bathing, he washed his clothes. She then took them and hung them in a sunny window to dry. He stood before her naked. "You're quite fetching," she said. He spun before her as if to show off his buff body. "I try." A sad expression crossed her face. "I'm sorry you're leaving me. It will be intolerable here without you." The dejection in her voice broke his heart. If only he could ease her horrible days. She stood and walked to a window. When she looked outside, she let out a distressed cry. "He's coming back! Quick, hide!" "I'll put you back with the apples," she said as she turned to face him. "No, I have a better idea. I can rid you of that beast. Once I'm through with him, he'll never bother you again." "How can you possibly defeat him? You're so small, he'll swat you like a fly." "Put me in the horse's mane next to its ear," he said, and she quickly did as he ordered. He was covering himself with horsehair when the door opened and the man walked inside. "My wife has gone to town. Wench, I need you." Instead of lifting her skirts, she backed away. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Raise those skirts or I'll beat you." "Leave her alone or you'll have hell to pay," Thumbling called from the vantage point of the horse's ear. "Who said that?" the man asked, turning as if to find the origin of the voice. "I did. You lay one fat hand on her, and I'll kick you until you beg me to stop." Thumbling whispered in the horse's ear for it to lift a hind leg and strike out with a kick, which the horse did as ordered. He gripped the horse's mane and turned the animal's head toward the man. "You, talking horse?" "Yes, I will speak and you shall listen," Thumbling said. "You touch her again and you'll be very sorry. You'll have to deal with me now, and the other animals will stand in for her benefit as well." He paused for effect. "We know where you sleep, and we know your routine. We know your wife, and we'll spill the beans to her about your carousing. She may not believe the women you've assaulted, but she'll be so terrified of us, she'll believe everything we tell her, and your life will become sheer misery." "This is sorcery!" He backed away, heading for the door. "I'll never touch you again. You have cursed me, foul wench. I'll toss you out on the streets." "Don't you dare," Thumbling said. "She stays here, and you pay her well to keep her silence and ours. Touch her again, and we'll let you have it in spades." He fled the barn, wailing about sorcery. She stood with her hands over her mouth, as if she couldn't believe what she saw. "You're a lifesaver," she said, and she turned to him, scooped him up in her hands, and planted a wet kiss on his face. "How can I ever thank you enough?" "You save your money and find a better place to work, where you are treated with the dignity you deserve. Once I finish my travels, I'll return to check up on you. Hopefully, you'll be well on your way to a new lovely home by then." She sat him up on the table. "Are you hungry? You wanted bread and soup. I have both." "Kind as well as beautiful," he said. "Yes, I'd love to eat." She poured soup into a thimble and tore him a slice of rye. She even spread fresh butter on the bread. As he ate, she nibbled on bread, and drank ale she told him she had stolen from the pantry. The man wouldn't miss it since he lost count of how much he drank. Once sated, Thumbling gathered his damp clothing and dressed. He took his belongings and stood to leave. "Safe travels, my friend," she said. She stuffed some bread into his knapsack. "I hope the bread satisfies you and lasts a long time." "As much as we satisfied each other?" He grinned. She giggled. "You were wonderful. I'll never forget you." He bowed and tipped his hat. Until we meet again, I refuse to say goodbye. She lifted him and placed him on the floor. He walked out the door into the bright daylight and waved to her as he walked down the road, heading toward the adventures he craved. He'd sleep well that night with her full breasts, musky scent, and vivid smile in his mind, giving him pleasant dreams for many nights to come. And that's our story. So this time, more than most, I want to hear your thoughts. Did I go too far? Should I avoid this kind of thing in the future? Call the voicemail line at 571-297-3325. Send me an email. Find me on Twitter. Details on contacting me can be found on the podcast website at nobilis.libsyn.com. If you're not supporting Nobilis Erotica, you're not getting the whole podcast. Sign up at patreon.com/nobilis to get monthly exclusive content. And if Patreon isn't your thing, there are plenty of other things you can do to support the show. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Join the Nobilis Erotica Facebook group. Follow on Twitter or Tumblr. Download our promo and get your favorite sexy podcast to play it. Heck, just share us when you like a story. Any of that stuff really helps listeners find us. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.